Hi, I'm Lucy Zipf. I'm a PhD candidate at Boston University. I work in Richard Premack's lab. We're a conservation biology lab that's really interested in phenology, or the timing of biological seasonal events like leaf out and bird arrival in the spring, and leaf color change and drop in the fall. Anything that you associate with a particular time of year is a phenological event. And particularly, I'm interested in how those different events kind of co-occur in time. So if you look around in spring right now, we're here to kind of investigate what phenological stage different plants and animals are, and how those stages kind of occur at the same time as different groups of plants, groups of animals, and how those interactions might inform kind of how the biological communities function. And so in particular, we're going to talk about the difference in timing of seasonal events between plants. And so you may kind of associate with spring, kind of warming temperatures, maybe a little bit of rain, and this is all stuff plants love. So when we talk about when plants, phenological events of plants include leafing out, when the leaves emerge, so we have kind of full leaves on this plant down here, where they're open, they're receiving light from the sun, they're photosynthesizing, they're making energy, they're storing that energy, so they're kind of in full function. And then if we kind of look up towards the canopy, we may see pretty small leaves on these taller trees. So in particular, we have really little leaves on this tree, and then some leaves that are just starting to unfold. And so even though the warming temperatures and increasing precipitation kind of makes all these plants start their spring, they start leafing out at a generally similar time, there's actually really big differences between the species that kind of co-occur in this very small area when their leaves emerge in the spring. And so again, if we saw this low-lying plant has these full leaves, it's totally photosynthesizing, totally open for business this spring and summer, and these taller trees are just starting to open their leaves. This difference in leaf emergence can be between 2 weeks and a month between plants that are literally right next to each other. And so there's a lot of reasons why different species might want to leaf out at different times. The low-lying species like this shrub need to leaf out pretty early in the spring because they need to receive that full light from the open canopy, whereas taller trees don't have that need. They will always be able to receive full light because they're the tallest things in the woods. So over time, evolution has acted on these smaller, lower-lying plants to leaf out earlier in the spring to be able to take advantage of that early season full sunlight. And there's not that same control on trees. In general, it may seem like it's always better to leaf out earlier because the earlier you leaf out, the more carbon you're able to store. But here in New England, we have pretty dicey springs sometimes where we can have really late season frost. This year, it's been pretty cold in the spring, even though we had a fairly warm winter. And so if we have really late season frosts or late season really cold nights and cold days, plants that leaf out too early, those leaves may get frost damage. And if they are damaged enough, they could die, and the plant would have to grow whole new leaves, and they may not be able to store enough carbon to reproduce successfully that year, so they couldn't make fruits and set fruits so the animals could eat and distribute them. And if they're frost damaged, they may not be able to make flowers to pollinate, so they can't breed. And so there's this big control in New England, especially when we have these like really late season frosts and these really variable springs, for controlling plants not to leaf out too early, because that kind of puts them at this frost damage risk, or they have this fear of frost, as we sometimes say in my lab. And so the shrubs kind of have less fear of frost because they need to leaf out early enough to get that full light, whereas trees are way more afraid of frost, and they're able to delay that leaf out event because they don't have that canopy limitation that shrubs have. So here we have a pretty young leaf. So I would definitely call this plant fully leafed out. You know, these leaves are flat, they're receiving sunlight, but you can see how this leaf might be very vulnerable to frost damage because it's very thin. We can kind of see maybe even how thin it is, and it's quite yellow. It's not the strong green we associate with mature leaves, and it's very soft. It doesn't have a waxy coating or any defense mechanism. So often when you have a leaf that is fully mature later in the summer, it'll feel much thicker, it'll feel kind of waxy on the top to protect it from rain and harmful sunlight and frost damage. But this leaf doesn't have any of that yet because it's pretty new and it's just getting going. So it's extra vulnerable early in the season to insects, to frost, or to any kind of extreme temperature events. And so that's why, again, these leaves have these controls of they want to leaf out early to get the most carbon and to sequester the most carbon and be exposed to the most sunlight, but they're so vulnerable early in the season, they can't leaf out too early and have too many risks like frost. So the deciduous plants that drop their leaves and regrow them every year, they have this, again, this really strong need to leaf out early in the spring to store a lot of carbon. But evergreen trees like this one, they don't have that control at all because they have green leaves out all year and they're needles. And so they can wait to leaf out until much later in the year, until there's no chance of frost damage, until there's lower chance of maybe early season insects or something that will, early season birds maybe, that will use those young leaves as part of their nest material. So trees like these don't leaf out until June or July. And so if you're walking much later in the summer, you may look at the end of one of these branches and see really green, small, soft needles. And so that is the first leaf of that plant. So again, it's months later than what we see at the rest of the deciduous trees here, which have already leafed out. So these guys don't have any of those strong controls.